Dr. Graham Hill is a criminologist and former senior investigating officer with the Surrey Police. During his career, Graham worked to solve some of the UK's most high-profile and infamous crimes, including the murder of Millie Dowler and the London night stalker Delroy Grant.
Someone has to be in charge. Someone has to bring the investigation towards its ultimate conclusion.
Graham, who specialises in child abduction and murder, assisted the Portuguese police in the investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. In this series, he's using his own insider knowledge and expertise to unpack the investigation from the inside out.
The public only ever sees the tip of the iceberg. I want to tell the full story and reveal how detectives brought a series of elusive killers to justice.
This is Murder Detective. Clapham in southwest London has a village-like atmosphere, and its vibrant nightlife attracts residents and visitors from all over the world.
It's a very desirable place to live. A lot of wealthy properties there, although on the fringes there are some rather poor, run-down, working-class council estates.
It's best known for Clapham Common, one of London's largest and oldest parks.
It's popular with cyclists, joggers and families, and any time, any day, it's normally very busy.
It's well used by a number of people. Families go there, sport is played there, there's tennis courts there, but it is big.
People flock there, particularly at weekends, to enjoy the sunshine, wander through the park and enjoy the sports facilities located there.
At night, the park is also known as a meeting place for gay men.
There's a huge gay community in Clapham, and you'll often see men walking up and down holding hands. You probably wouldn't have seen that quite so much in 2005. And there was also some people within the community that weren't very happy about this area being used for a place to meet.
It was a well-known cruising area in the wooded section. People used to go there, mostly at night, for rendezvous and sometimes sex.
On the night of the 14th of October 2005, police received a call about a vicious attack on the Common.
A witness who was out jogging on the common saw the attack and intervened, and he himself was threatened, so had to back off, and he called the police. The initial responders would be uniform officers who, following the 999 call, rushed to the scene.
When the emergency services arrived, it was clear the victim had sustained a vicious attack and was in a life-threatening condition.
And as a result of that, the on-call detective or senior investigating officer would have been called to the scene. Early on, that officer would have had to make a number of key decisions. The first one would have been how far to cordon off the area, then look for the potential suspects, then carry out searches, and then protect the scene for forensic opportunities.
This case has always stuck in my mind because as an SIO you become desensitised to injuries, but those injuries were so horrendous, they're difficult to forget.
The man who alerted the police told the police immediately that the two attackers had used the most foul and extraordinary homophobic language.
Clearly with the homophobic comments that were heard by the witness at the time of the attack, it was a homophobic attack. The park was unlit. Any description we had was very limited. How long they carried on the assault for after having seen the witness is not entirely clear.
12 hours after the attack, Nick Scholar, an experienced detective at the Metropolitan Police, was tasked to lead the investigation team. Graham is on his way to meet Nick at the original crime scene on Clapham Common.
Nick, here we are on Clapham Common. Can you tell me what you were thinking when you got to the scene that morning?
When you arrive, you're looking for your evidential opportunities.
As you can see, as we stand on the common and look around, there are no houses that overlook the scene. No passing vehicles would overlook the scene either. No one in those vehicles or on the buses would see anything. Immediately, your opportunities to get witnesses are shrinking. We've got the scene behind us. I'd ensure that the cordons were in the correct place, in my opinion, that they weren't going to miss any evidence or possible exhibits by being too narrow. I'd ensure the officers were correctly manning the cordons, that the forensic officers knew what they were doing. I'd chat to them just to see we're all singing from the same song sheet about what they were looking for. Search teams would be doing a fingertip search through the long grass, because anything that's dropped could easily fall to the roots and not be visible to the naked eye. So there'd be an in-depth search of the grass around the attack scene in case anyone had dropped anything.
So approximately how many people did you have working on this investigation in the early stages, the first 24 hours or so?
Well, it's a fluid number. Obviously on the night you're going to get uniform response, you're going to get an on-call CID team. My team will be coming in, that'll be 20 to 30 officers. The local CID will offer some assistance when they can. The on-call team will remain on duty. You'd ask your own team supervisors, you'd give them clear direction as to what you wanted from everyone once your large inquiry was set, and they'd be responsible for seeing them push through.
With just one known witness to the attack, it was at this point that SIO Nick Scholar made a key decision to bring awareness to the search. He contacted the media.
From the very nature of the offence and accepting that it was a hate crime, clearly we had to reassure the community that it was being taken seriously, and we're doing everything we can to make sure they were safe. That had to go out through a good, strong media appeal, pushing those community safety lines, and at the same time asking for witnesses to come forward who could help us catch the attackers.
Meanwhile, the victim, who was still unknown, had been rushed to hospital.
The severity, the savagery of this beating put it in a completely different class. And within a few hours, it was patently clear, despite the efforts of paramedics and hospital things, that there was no saving him.
And unfortunately, he died in hospital a short while later. Once he died, the Met would have been committed to running a murder investigation. Now, murders are categorised A, B and C. A Cat A murder is where the offender is unknown and it has a significant impact on the community.
You don't know who the victim is initially, and you certainly have no idea whatsoever who the perpetrators are. You've got eyewitness that says there were two people that were attacking. It's a Category A homicide, and that means you can put a lot of resources into it.
As the crime scene was being established, some of the local community approached detectives on the ground to alert them to a friend who'd been missing since the attack. 24-year-old bar manager Jody Dabrowski.
Some of Jody's friends had realised there were police activity, there were blue lights, there were sirens. They didn't know what it was, but they nevertheless approached the police. They'd been together earlier in the evening and been drinking together. So they were able to remove a glass that they knew their friend Jody had been drinking and fingerprint that, obtain fingerprints, and able to then compare those with the fingerprints of the victim that was on Clapham Common. And the fingerprints matched.
The attack on Jody Dabrowski had been brutal, unprovoked, and tragically fatal. SIO Nick Scholar and his team were faced with a community in panic and killers at large. Senior Investigating Officer Nick Scholar had been drafted in with his homicide team to investigate an unprovoked and brutal murder on Clapham Common. They had identified the victim as 24-year-old bar manager Jody Dabrowski. Jody's autopsy revealed the ferocity of the attack.
The autopsy report identified 33 separate areas of injury. These included a swollen brain, broken nose, bruises to his spine and groin, and a crushed larynx.
Jodie's injuries were, by any normal standards, horrific. If you compare how he looked when he was alive with all of the horrible bruising and swelling and distortion that was present after this attack, it just tells you about the level of violence, the level of repeated blows and impacts to his head.
You could draw conclusions just how significant and how severe it was. There were no obvious weapons in the area. It appears to have just been kicking and punching.
Feet are a very powerful weapon. Kicks and stamps can cause all manner of injury. They're certainly going to fracture the fragile bones of the face. They can cause bleeding around the brain, and repeated blows to the head can actually tear the nerve fibres in the brain itself and cause this diffuse damage throughout the brain that can, in itself, even without bleeding, be fatal. The first officer on the scene describes Jodie's face as a bloody pulp. And that tells you, really, how he appeared to even somebody who's experienced at looking at the victims of violence.
Having confirmed the victim's identity, police needed to inform Jodie's family.
Police turned up on the door early morning, and it didn't make sense. You know, when we were told it was, we were told he'd been attacked. We were trying to figure out what was it about. You know, we assumed it was something to do with work, where he had maybe had a problem with some clients. You know, we arrived at the hospital in Tooting a little just too late, and he'd already passed. And we weren't allowed to see him. We weren't allowed to go near him at that point, because as soon as that had happened, he becomes evidence. Everything about him becomes evidence, and we weren't allowed to touch, not been able to see.
In the hunt for the killers, Nick Scola and his team needed to find out more about the victim, Jodie Dabrowski.
Jodie was described to us as a gentle giant. He was popular, had a good sense of humour, and liked by everyone.
He got on well with all sorts of people, you know, people he was when he was a kid. You know, he got on with people older than him, he got on with people from much different spaces than him.
Jodie was young, bright, handsome, a very kind, sweet, gentle person, the kind of person that most of us would love to have as a friend.
Jodie Dabrowski was an up-and-coming young man. He was 24. He'd come up from Stroud in Gloucestershire, where he'd acted as a bar manager, and he'd got a job doing similar work, but with a jongleur comedy chain.
And he was so successful there and so well liked, did the job extremely well, they actually promoted him. And he was out celebrating with friends from that club that evening when unfortunately he was attacked.
Having quickly identified Jodie Dabrowski as the victim, investigators needed to start looking at his attackers. They had one vital witness statement as their lead.
The witness was only able to say that there was 2 white attackers, and that they believed from what the attackers said that it was a homophobic attack, and they described as one attacker being taller than the other attacker.
He saw 2 men attacking someone who was on the ground. He tried to intervene and ask what they were doing, at which stage they used homophobic insults, said the man they were attacking was a pufter and it was okay to kill him, and then threatened the witness himself. As part of a handover briefing, I listened to what everyone has known. I read whatever there is to read about the incident. I would then go to the scene and make any additional decisions that I think are necessary.
Whenever an officer studies a murder scene, they're looking for a number of things. They're looking for witnesses, they're looking for forensic opportunities, and in this particular case, those forensic opportunities don't appear to have been there. There was one witness that witnessed the attack that couldn't really give much of a description of the offenders, so there was very little for those detectives to go on during the early stages of the investigation.
By the time I'm called in, the on-call team had taken the initial steps. They had begun the search for evidence, they had begun the forensic investigation, set the cordons and set some parameters. And my job is to satisfy myself that all the parameters they set initially are still relevant in light of any new information that might have come in, or whether they need to be set further or wider.
Nick and his team started to examine Jodie's movements in the days leading up to the murder.
Clearly we didn't know whether Jodie was attacked by strangers or someone he knew, so we look a bit into Jodie's lifestyle and we asked for help from the community. Had Jodie been involved in any confrontations at work? Had he got any enemies?
He'd gone to see a friend on the Friday. She was somebody who was he'd been working with, and he was just going to say goodbye, really. He'd gone over and spent the evening with her, so he was walking home from there.
Jodie was intercepted on that walk home by two men who struck up a conversation and then unleashed a tirade of violent assaults upon him. Assaults that resulted in his death the following day, the 15th of October.
With no apparent connection between Jodie and his killers, the challenge for detectives was where to begin their search.
London's a very dense population. You only have to go a mile and suddenly you have tens of thousands of people on your matrix potentially. So let's start fairly close and let's start to expand our matrices. But in doing that, what we have to do also is elimination criteria. Then the inquiries will start as to where are these people now? And what you generally find is some of those you're actually able to eliminate because they've been arrested in other places and therefore they're now in prison and not capable of doing it. It's about then tracing, implicating or eliminating that person. In other words, you're kind of looking for an alibi for these people to eliminate them.
Jodie's murder did not provoke a widespread panic in the LGBT plus community, but it did reinforce the notion that we are not truly safe, that at any moment, out of the blue, we could be set upon and perhaps even killed. And that created a level of anxiety, understandably, among LGBT plus people.
Back in the investigation room, Graham reviews the crime scene with Nick Scola.
We've got some pictures that are relevant to the investigation. This first picture, can you talk me through it? It appears to be Clapham Common.
This is the common. You can see how isolated it is. This was the crime scene itself. In the centre of the picture you can see some debris, and that's where the paramedics had tried to save Jodie's life or treated him at the scene. When they leave the scene, they leave the bandaging and the open packaging that they'd used there, just in case there's any potential forensic retrieval from that. That's where he would have been attacked, where you see that. You get the impression, looking, you see there's no natural street lighting in the area because the attack was carried out after dark, so you can see how difficult it would be for any witnesses or anybody else to identify the parties involved.
Absolutely. What Nick Scola had to do was keep the investigation focused while he was under quite significant pressure to solve the case. And by doing that, he had to find priority lines of investigation. So Nick, earlier on we were talking, and you were talking about a particular briefing early on in the investigation where you felt that you and the team were under some considerable pressure to solve this crime. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I knew I'd be walking into a wall of pressure in reality. It was a Category A investigation, the media would be very involved with it, and my decisions and the way I investigate it would be subject to scrutiny both in the short term and, if it was unsolved, in the longer term in more minute detail.
It's not just a murder, it's a Cat A murder, it's a homophobic attack, and it's also a hate crime. And when you get those three things together, you find that there's going to be immense internal and external scrutiny, and that's what causes some difficulty for some SIOs. One of the policies you made early on was around CCTV and the collection or the harvesting of that material. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
In this day and age, CCTV is integral to every investigation. This had occurred on Clapham Common, and from my knowledge of the area, I knew there wouldn't actually be any CCTV covering the crime scene itself. And we might struggle to work out how the suspects got to and from the crime scene, or how the victim got there. In a residential area like that, although it's in central London, there's not many shops immediately adjacent to the commons. So you're knocking on front doors, asking if they've got CCTV. We've got buses that are going to go by, and we've got the transport hubs. We've got Clapham Junction Railway Station, not far away, Clapham South Underground Station. We don't have to view it all, but if you haven't collected it, you can't view it.
When you harvest or bank CCTV, you have to ask yourself what is relevant and what isn't relevant. So what you're doing is you're actually saving it for a rainy day.
Detectives found no further clues in the CCTV footage, but it was at this point that SIO Nick Scholar's local knowledge of the area played a key part in moving the case forward.
DCI Nick Scholar, the senior investigating officer in this case, had actually served as a police officer in another time around the area. He knew Clapham. He knew what made it breathe. He knew what the streets were like.
Some years before, I'd worked at Battersea Police Station, which was the area that covered the common, and I dealt with another incident in a hostel. It was a very grand old house, and it struck me as I walked in what a nice house it had been, and how grand it had been at one stage. So I had people go back to that address, but made it a wider line of inquiry to establish what other large houses had now been converted into hostels in the vicinity of the common.
What he found strange, and a dichotomy, was that you had this wonderful street of wonderful Edwardian, effectively manor houses, and one of them had been converted into a bail hostel or a refuge for released prisoners.
We knew two men had attacked Jody. There's nowhere really nearby convenient to park a car, so you got the impression they were walking somewhere. They could have driven there specifically to attack someone at 11:30 at night, but I thought that was unlikely. They'd probably been walking to a transport hub, or they may have been walking home. And if they're walking home, a hostel was one of the options.
Nick Scholar's hunch about the hostels was absolutely spot on. The decision to concentrate on the homes and the hostels is a fast-track action. It's something that needs to be done urgently. It means that officers are going to go straight to those hostels to try and find who is in those hostels, who the occupants are.
That change of tack, that focus on the hostels, proved to be a pivotal moment in the investigation, didn't it?
It was a good line of inquiry because the team went and visited hostels, and as they visited one particular hostel, one of the residents who hadn't been in touch with us in any way told us that two of the other residents had come back late that Friday night covered in blood and talked about giving someone a good kicking on the common.
SIO Nick Scholar and his team are closing in on two suspects over the brutal murder of bar manager Jody Dabrowski in Clapham. Two men have been identified as prime suspects, Scott Walker and Thomas Pickford.
We visited some of the large houses, and officers went to one where a resident told us about two other residents who'd come back late that Friday evening, covered in blood, talking about beating a puffer up, almost bragging about it.
Police learn that Scott Walker is still living at the hostel. They arrest him and gather evidence for the investigation.
His room becomes a crime scene and is searched thoroughly by forensic officers. His clothing is seized, and that is also sent off for forensic examination at the laboratory.
While Scott Walker was taken away for police interview, the other suspect, Thomas Pickford, was not at the address. He'd been thrown out of the hostel. His whereabouts were unknown.
He's actually not at the hostel because he's been ejected from there for taking heroin, and the staff don't know where he is. We now have a manhunt. Manhunts for suspects are very intense, very dynamic. Information coming in, acted upon immediately. That lifestyling of him, what we know about him, all pays dividends. Looking at everybody that he knows, every single place he goes. One of those addresses is in Croydon. There is Pickford. Pickford is now arrested, taken to a police station. He becomes a crime scene. Clothing is taken, all sent for forensic evidence.
With both suspects in custody, Nick Scola's first step was to focus on the attacker's previous criminal history.
They'd gone to the hostel, having been released from prison. They didn't know each other prior to meeting at the hostel. We investigate any similar attacks that have been carried out in the area. That might help us identify potential suspects. On this occasion, there had been an attack on a gay man on the common 2 weeks previously. This man was knocked to the ground and knocked unconscious.
They had attacked other gay people on the common in the weeks leading up to this, and it felt like there was a build-up of violence.
Queer bashing goes way, way back in time. If you go back to the 50s, people were queer bashed. You know, there were times when the police would actually go out to try and entrap gay men who were actually maybe cottaging. There's always been a culture of queer bashing and oppression towards gay men or queer men.
Jodi's vicious murder was an extreme example of the many hundreds of homophobic hate crimes that were taking place across Britain at that time. Homophobic violence often comes from a very dark place, based on fear of the unknown, based on ignorance, based on stereotypes. But also in some cases, it's because the assailants are insecure about their own sexuality. In extreme cases, it may even be because they themselves secretly deep down are gay, and they use homophobia as a way to convince themselves that they're really straight. Research in the United States by Professor Henry Adams found that 80% of viciously homophobic men are secret, self-loathing, repressed homosexuals. They use homosexuality as a way to deflect suspicion from their own sexuality and to convince themselves that they can't be gay because they bash gay people.
It's still happening. There's been recent cases, quite high-profile ones, where there's still deaths happening through homophobic abuse, and I don't get it. I just don't understand why that would bother somebody else.
The forensic lab working on the samples taken from the prime suspects reported back to Nick that the blood on footwear found in Scott Walker's room matched that of Jodi's.
One of the things you must remember about evidence is one piece is not good enough. Just because we have victims' blood on a shoe doesn't mean to say the case is solved. You still need more evidence. We need to prove that they were in the vicinity at the time.
Despite having apprehended the men suspected of the attack, despite having identified incriminating forensic evidence linking them to the crime scene, Nick and his team needed to place the two men actually at the scene. Nick Scola and his team looked back through the CCTV gathered on the night of the murder.
Now we've got Walker and Pickford as suspects. We know what they look like. We can go back at the CCTV we've collected and try and identify their movements throughout the evening, to look at the clothing they were wearing. So when we submit clothing for forensic analysis, we can ensure that we actually submit what they were wearing.
These two men had been out drinking in Lavender Hill, and clearly this was going to be a night where they would seek the additional adrenaline thrill of attacking defenceless people.
We were able to see them in a bar in Clapham Common, so we could see they'd been drinking and drinking quite heavily. We could then follow their route back toward the hostel, and we were able to speak to another witness, a lady who got off the bus on the way, who could say two men fitting their description had harassed her as she'd got off. They'd grabbed her arm and made some lewd comments before she walked away, get a general feel for their behaviour.
With both men in custody, it was vital at this point for Nick and his team to prepare the evidence that would connect the two suspects to the attack on Jody Dabrowski and help secure a conviction.
This is an overview or a map of the area where the attack took place. Can you talk me through the significance of the dots on this picture?
The yellow one is where they were drinking, and the second yellow one is where they wanted to get back to. The blue dot here is where the woman was approached as she got off a bus, and they made some lewd comments to her. So we know that was part of their route home, and they went down a paved street there. And then to get back to the hostel, the best way would have just been to carry on walking around the paved streets. But instead, where we see Jodie was attacked, they've left the paved streets and walked into the unlit area. It was an unnecessary diversion. Clearly they were looking for someone to attack, I would imagine, but they certainly didn't need to walk into that area to get home.
When they returned to this hostel after the attack, they were very open about what had happened. One of them said, "Oh, we've just kicked crap out of this bloke, it felt really good." And they were clearly full of adrenaline about what had happened.
With the CCTV and the witness statements from both scenes of the attack as well as the bail hostel, Nick and his team were confident they had enough evidence to bring the suspects to trial. What Nick didn't know was that this case would be groundbreaking in hate crime law. On the night of the 14th of October 2005, 24-year-old Jody Dabrowski was the victim of a brutal and fatal homophobic assault as he walked home through Clapham Common. Graham Hill has been looking at the case with the SIO, Nick Scholar, who led the investigation team and had tracked down and arrested two men, Scott Walker and Thomas Pickford.
The investigation into Jody Dabrowski's murder hinged on one crucial decision made by the SIO, Nick Scholar. He decided to refocus the investigation towards hostels in the Clapham Common area. That decision was born out of his own experience as an SIO, and that decision was the one that led directly to the killers being identified. I cannot stress to you how important it is for SIOs that run murder investigations to be experienced detectives.
You've got corroborative evidence of them going towards the scene from closed-circuit television. You've got them going away from the scene. And quite tellingly, you've actually got them in the hostel at a relevant time just after the attack, actually saying to somebody in the hostel that they'd actually beaten up a gay guy on the common.
Eyewitnesses described Jodie's head being stamped upon. This is an important piece of information because this tells the pathologist, the crime scene investigators, that it is going to be very important to look for any patterned bruises that might match footwear. And with bruising, particularly with stamps or with a patterned item striking you, you can get very distinctive bruising that can match very clearly to a piece of footwear. And that is important evidence.
The trial began in early 2006 at the Old Bailey. It was revealed that at the time of the murderous assault on Dabrowski, one of the defendants, Scott Walker, had been on probation for another shocking attack.
The key thing about Scott Walker was his violent history. He had only been released early from a prison sentence. This was an attack on his own mother. He had pushed her against the door, he punched her, he kicked her, he broke her nose. And this is his own mother. That suggests not only is this man short-tempered, extremely violent, but he's a man who's out of control. Thomas Pickford is a sad individual who follows people he hero worships. He was clearly overawed by Scott Walker, and on his arrest he told the police that he had started the attack by just out of nowhere just raining punches in on Jody Dabrowski in order to impress the other man. He wanted to be seen in the other man's eyes as a hard man himself. What was so unusual on this matter was that how rare it is for anyone to plead guilty to murder. But in this case, the evidence was so overwhelming that both Pickford and Walker took the decision to plead guilty to murder.
And it's one of the things that irritate us in a way, that when people say, oh, it's just as well they pleaded guilty. No, they didn't. Not until the very last minute did they plead guilty. And that's because it was very clear that they had no defence and that the evidence was overwhelming.
The killers were cold, cruel, callous men, hyped up on machismo and homophobia.
They were just a pair of thoroughly nasty, egotistical animals, predators.
Notably, this case became a landmark in sentencing around sexual discrimination, based on a bill passed some 3 years earlier.
This was the first case in which Section 146 of the Criminal Justice Act 2003 was invoked. It allows for an extended sentence where there's evidence that the perpetrators targeted someone because of their sexual orientation.
It was the groundbreaking trial in the sense it was the first time that homophobia was treated, was a specific offence, a specific hate crime that carried different sentencing.
They knew what was coming. They'd been briefed by their lawyers that it would be a massive sentence. And it was a sense of shrugging their shoulders. They didn't engage in the process at all. They didn't engage in anybody in court. They sat there and then stood up to be sentenced.
Both Thomas Pickford and Scott Walker were sentenced to life imprisonment with the recommendation that they serve a minimum of 28 years.
That is 28 years, including the reduction for the guilty pleas.
We were told by other people they won't come out because they're the sort of people that are going to reoffend in jail. So that felt like a comfort in the sense that they're not going to be around. That was a big relief, really.
The lawyers were telling me that they would normally be expected a minimum sentence of 15 years before this time, but with the new legislation, it was almost double to 28 years.
When you get to that 28-year period, you're not automatically released. That's the earliest possible date that you can be released. Still have to go through a process, and it still has to be approved by the parole board. There's no guarantee that they will get out after 28 years. They may well be in for a much longer time than that. You've got to remember, this was a hate crime. Nothing more, nothing less, a hate crime.
Despite the new law and lengthy sentences, can there be justice in these types of cases?
I think as far as it can go, there's justice. It's difficult to feel that at the time because it's difficult to know how to feel, really. But given they had the maximum possible sentencing they could, we felt that had been done. Yeah, sure.
Probably the only good thing that came out of the tragedy of this shocking murder is that the killers were caught. They're locked up, and now they can't harm anyone else.
In the anniversary of Jodie's murder in 2012, we actually installed a bench on the common in his memory. The police were conscious that they wanted to reach out and connect with the LGBT community. And also Lambeth Council were very keen to connect with the LGBT community. So there was a fundraiser at the Two Brewers pub where money was raised to actually pay for a bench. So lots of people met and installed the bench. There wasn't a whole installing of the bench, which happened, I think it was on a Sunday. It wasn't placed where Jodie actually fell. It was placed on a bit of a mound so that people could actually sit on this bench and reflect on what had happened. And of course the bench overlooks the whole of the cruising PSE area. It has been commemorated every year since.
Nick Scola's determination and prior knowledge of the area led him and his team to catch the offenders and bring them to justice. It's a testament to the incredible lengths an SIO goes to get a case solved.
Nick Scola and his team did an absolutely fantastic job. To make that leap of faith that we're going to go down this strand of the inquiry and spend a lot of time and manpower and effort doing this because I believe it will actually have benefits. He was absolutely right to do that. It was a leap of faith. It's part of the investigative toolbox that a senior investigating officer has.
Having been to a lot of violent situations and murder scenes, you do get a little bit hardened to it. Yet injuries I saw on Jodie still shock me.
Nick Scola came to see us from London to Gloucestershire a couple of occasions to brief us. You know, he came himself as well as senior officers, and we just felt well cared for and well informed. And the way they managed the case itself from day one was superb.
Jodie's horrific murder shocked the gay community and indeed much of wider straight society. People thought that this kind of extreme violence was a thing of the past. You know, we'd convinced ourselves that society had moved on. It was a wake-up call.
In my professional opinion, I think Nick Scola's leadership was excellent. He was able to drive the investigation in its early stages, even while under significant pressure, both internally and externally. And he was able to refocus the investigation towards a very positive line of inquiry that eventually led to the identification and conviction of Jodie's killers.